What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. I'm very excited tonight because we're continuing our discussion of emotional sobriety. The last year and a half, we went through the 12 steps and discussed how the 12 steps help us achieve emotional sobriety. And now we're taking various topics. The first one we took was differentiation, and we explored how differentiation relates to and helps us understand emotional sobriety. And I think that you're going to find that our discussion of self-esteem is also very relevant to understanding some of the elements or components of what makes up emotional sobriety. To kick us off tonight is my good friend, my colleague, someone I love and care about very much, and that's you, Roger. And Roger will tell you about his background and his experience with I consider the foremost authority on self-esteem, which is Nathaniel Branden. So I'll turn the meeting over to you, Raj.
Thank you, Alan, very much for the opportunity to, as you said, kick off the self-esteem portion for the next several meetings. Alan will determine how many. We're going to be talking about self-esteem, what it is, what it isn't, how it's connected with, and the commonalities it has with emotional sobriety. I want to welcome everyone. Thanks for making time to be here tonight or this evening, or whatever time of day it is in your part of the world. I want to begin by talking about the relationship between self-esteem and self-concept or self-image. Much of what I'll discuss this evening is drawn from the work of Dr. Nathaniel Branden, a prolific author on self-esteem and a psychotherapist who both Alan and I have tremendous respect for and have learned a lot from in the area of self-esteem. As an undergraduate, many decades ago, I read his first book on the subject of self-esteem called The Psychology of Self-Esteem, published in 1969. And I was very excited by a lot of the ideas he wrote about in that book, both for my own awareness related to my individual self-esteem, as well as for the field of psychology generally and people in general. In 1972, after receiving my bachelor's degree, I chuckle because I'm amazed it was that long ago. I moved from Indiana, where I was raised, to Los Angeles in order to undertake personal therapy with Nathaniel Branden and to study with him in an informal training seminar that Dr. Branden conducted. In his book, Honoring the Self, in 1983, he wrote in the book's first sentence, "Of all the judgments we pass in life, none is as important as the one we pass on ourselves. For that judgment touches the very center of our existence." And I want you to reflect on that for a moment. Of all the judgments we make in life, and if you're like me, you're making judgments about anything and everything, none of them are as important as the judgment we pass on ourselves. He later quotes Goethe, the famous German poet and novelist and scientist. Goethe said the greatest evil that can befall a man or people is that he should come to think ill of himself. That's a pretty powerful statement from somebody as brilliant as Goethe. The greatest evil that can befall man is that he should come to think ill of himself. Branden wrote about the connection between self-esteem and the notion of self-concept or self-image. He wrote, the greatest barrier to achievement and success is not lack of talent or ability, but rather the fact that achievement and success above a certain level are outside of our individual self-concept, our image of who we are and what is appropriate to us and for us. The greatest barrier to love is the secret fear that we are unlovable. The greatest barrier to happiness is the wordless sense that happiness is not our proper destiny. So he's saying all that to point to so much of our experience in our life and what we're open to experiencing in our life is not about talent or ability. It's about the limits of our self-concept, the limits, our ideas about ourselves and what's appropriate for us, what is possible for us, the limits that those ideas place on our functioning. In 1987, he published a small book, which is one of my favorites because it's much more concise than some of his books, called How to Raise Your Self-Esteem. And he wrote more about the relationship between self-concept and self-esteem in that book. Our self-concept is who and what we consciously and subconsciously think we are. Our physical and psychological traits, our assets and liabilities, and above all, our self-esteem. Self-esteem is the evaluative component of our self-concept. Do I like myself or do I not like myself? Do I feel relatively happy and relatively satisfied most of the time with who I am as a person? Or do I feel bad about myself? Do I judge myself? Do I feel very unsatisfied with the person that I am? So self-esteem is the evaluative component of our self-concept, the judgment component, if you will. This is a very powerful idea. Our self-concept shapes our destiny. What does he mean? That is, our deepest vision of ourselves influences all of our significant choices and decisions, and therefore shapes the kind of life we create for ourselves. Now, I want to say that again. My deepest vision of myself, your deepest vision, your deepest sense of who you are, shapes and influences all of the significant choices and decisions that I make or that you make in our life. As an example, if I grew up in a family in which I did not feel consistently loved or valued, it's fairly likely that I'll form a belief about myself. That belief is what we call our self-concept or self-image, that I am unlovable. I mean, after all, if even my own parents don't love me, what hope do I have, right? This does not mean, by the way, that my parents didn't love me. From their point of view, they might felt they loved me deeply, and they may have from their perspective. But if they were not able to express their love in a way where I experienced being loved, then my experience is that I'm not loved. And I might draw from that the conclusion that I'm unlovable. If I felt loved at a fundamental level, I'm likely to form a very different idea of myself, a very different conclusion about myself. But in my sense or my belief that they don't care, I can easily then set about the process that Alan has described in several of our meetings. The process of developing a false self in my quest to figure out exactly who it is I need to be to receive the love from them that I desire. But there's a problem with that strategy. Even if I succeed in conforming myself to their expectations well enough, I'm still left with the internal awareness that I have to be somebody other than who I really am in order to receive love in the world. I'm left with still the conviction that I am not lovable as I am. And I'm very likely to carry this belief into adulthood. And when love is offered to me, I'm likely to fear receiving it, to fear opening up to it. For one thing, it's likely to open up a lot of the pain that I felt from earlier in my life when I did not feel loved. But I'm also fearful of being disappointed. If I open to love, will I be left? Will I be abandoned? Will I be overwhelmed by that love? Swallowed up by it? So I may withdraw even when the love opportunity presents itself. I may feel unable to express love as well as to receive it. And I may, in fact, resign myself to a life of emotional isolation and loneliness. If I was taught that I'm a bad kid or worthless or incapable of, quote, doing things right or stupid or 1,000 different messages that we may have absorbed and come to believe at a young age about ourselves, all of those ideas can become part of my self-image, part of my self-concept, and they can wreak total havoc with my life if I hold on to those ideas until I become aware that I am operating from a lot of those beliefs. A lot of those beliefs are absorbed by us, not through things we were told, but through how we were treated and conclusions we drew about ourselves from other people's behavior toward us. Or sometimes it does involve things that we were told. But the damaging, limiting aspects of those negative beliefs about ourselves, beliefs usually formed before we had any adult level consciousness, adult ability to question those beliefs, continue to influence us. It's in this way that our self-concept can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I have a deep and abiding belief that I'm unlovable, I'm going to behave as if I'm unlovable. I'm going to be unavailable. I'm going to be difficult to connect to. I'm going to be very self-protective. People are probably going to respond to that by keeping their distance from me. That, in turn, perpetuates and reflects and encourages my belief that I'm unlovable, right? The same for any of those beliefs we might hold. If I feel like I'm incapable, or if I'm a bad person, let me use that example. If I feel like I'm a bad guy or a bad human being, and I have that deep-seated belief about myself, that's going to dictate a lot of my behavior. I'm going to behave badly. I'm going to make bad choices. I'm going to violate norms and rules. And then the feedback that other people and life is going to give me is what? Is I'm a bad person. So that's the sense in which Branden means self-concept is destiny. Self-concept, my self-concept in certain elements can be very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's move on to self-esteem then. What is self-esteem? Well, Nathaniel believes it's the integration of two primary elements. The first is my level of self-confidence, and the second is my level of self-respect. Self-confidence and self-respect. Self-worth is also interwoven with self-respect in his self-esteem theory and thinking. He put it a little more formally when he said, self-esteem is the disposition or the inclination, you could say, to experience ourselves as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life. That's the self-confidence piece, right? Competent to cope with the basic challenges of life, and as being worthy of happiness, deserving of happiness. That's the self-respect or self-worth part. That includes ideas about worthiness of love, worthiness of success, worthiness of an experience of joy or excitement or happiness in my life. Now, a couple of points that are very important to make. Self-esteem is not an all or nothing phenomenon, just like emotional sobriety is not all or nothing. Some days we're closer than others. Some days we feel better about ourselves than other days. In some areas of our life, we typically function better and therefore feel better than in other areas. I might be wonderful at making money in my life, but terrible at communication and personal relationships, or vice versa. I might be, really good at communication and terrible at making money. So self-esteem is not black and white. It's not all or nothing. It's up and down a lot. Although in general, we can talk about a deep, generalized sense of self-esteem that we have. And I think it's valid to talk about that. The good news is that we can learn how to change. We can learn tools that we need. And I'll talk about some of those practices in a few minutes. We can learn how to raise our feelings of self-worth, of self-respect, and of self-confidence. It's not easy, just like learning emotional sobriety is not easy. But we can absolutely learn how to raise our level of self-esteem, self-respect, self-confidence. In order to understand what self-esteem is, it can also be very helpful to understand what it's not. In 1987, in his book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem, Branden wrote this: when we appreciate the true nature of self-esteem, we see that it is not comparative. And we talked about this a lot already with regard to emotional sobriety, and it's not competitive. Self-esteem is a function of our self relationship, our relationship to different parts of who we are. It's not fundamentally competitive or comparative. Or if it is, we're putting our self-esteem, just as if we make our emotional sobriety comparative and competitive, I'm more emotionally, sober than you, whatever that would mean. You're more emotionally sober than me. That's what I mean by being comparative or competitive. Self-esteem is not about that. Genuine self-esteem, he writes, is not expressed by self-glorification at the expense of others. Really important idea. Or by the quest to make oneself superior to others, or to diminish others so as to elevate oneself. None of those ideas have anything to do with what he regards and what I regard as genuine self-esteem. Arrogance, boastfulness, and overestimation of our abilities reflect inadequate self-esteem, rather than, as some people imagine, too much self-esteem. And I think we all kind of understand this at a basic level. If I'm in a mode where I'm trying to make sure, everybody understands that I know this or I know that, or I'm the person who has to have the last word about something, that doesn't indicate an abundance of self-esteem within me, right? That indicates a deficiency in self-esteem. Alan and Thom and I and Herb have talked about this a lot. When we're looking to others to validate our sense of self-worth too much, we've put our self-worth on extremely shaky ground. So none of those ideas, boastfulness, arrogance, have anything to do with actual self-esteem. He writes, one of the most important characteristics of healthy self-esteem is that it's the state of one who is not at war, either with himself or herself, or with others. The importance of healthy self-esteem lies in the fact that it is the foundation of our ability to respond actively and positively. Again, there's a lot of crossovers with emotional sobriety here. It's the foundation of our ability to respond actively and positively to the opportunities of our life, in work, in love, and in play. It is also the foundation of that serenity of spirit that makes the enjoyment of life possible. So obviously, from Branden's point of view, and I'm very much on board with this idea, I know Alan is as well, self-esteem matters, right? Our level of self-esteem and the nature of our self-concept, how we see ourselves, really makes a difference in our degree of life satisfaction, in how confident we feel, how willing we are to take risks in our life, and so on. In 1994, Branden published his definitive work on self-esteem called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. It was kind of his, summary work for his entire several decades of work on self-esteem. As I read through these 6 pillars, keep in mind and notice the commonalities that you hear and you see between self-esteem and emotional sobriety. Pillar number 1, and these are also not just pillars conceptually, these are practices. Each one of them is a practice. The more we put into practice these concepts, the more our self-esteem strengthens. The first one, which is also one that Alan gave a great deal of attention to in his emotional sobriety books, living consciously. Ring a bell? Living consciously refers to being willing to make the choice to address rather than avoid problems in our life. It means our willingness to try to use our mind to the best of our ability and our creativity to find solutions to the problems that we're going to be confronted with in our life. To increase our level of self-esteem, we need to make connecting to reality our goal, not building up my ego, not building up that part of me that wants to impress other people and get my sense of self-worth or self-respect or confidence from them. Self-esteem is intimately connected with how able I am to connect with and align myself with reality. How do we talk about that in emotional sobriety? Living life on life's terms, right? The same basic idea. We can choose to avoid, minimize, deny, and distort reality, or we can engage it, again, to the best of our ability to perceive reality and engage the pain that reality will sometimes bring. The higher the level of our awareness, our consciousness, the higher our level of self-esteem. The higher the state of consciousness I bring to my life on a regular basis, not every moment. Again, it's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. The higher my level of self-esteem. Self-acceptance is number 2, the second practice, which you've heard me talk about a lot if you've been attending these meetings regularly. Self-acceptance refers to our ability to accept all of our experience, including fear, grief, anger, loneliness, along with trust, happiness, love. It's the refusal that, again, Branden talks about, to be in an adversarial or oppositional relationship to our own experience. It's a willingness to look at and be curious about and investigate and seek to understand rather than judge whatever is going on for us. That's what self-acceptance really means. Doesn't mean I like it. Doesn't mean I like the experience I'm having and I don't want to change it. But it means I'm willing to investigate it. I'm willing to look at it. It also, self-acceptance, incorporates elements of self-compassion, self-forgiveness, a sense of being on my side, you being on your side in your life rather than against you, and elements of self-encouragement. The third pillar or practice is self-responsibility. Again, we talk a lot about self-responsibility in emotional sobriety. A self-responsible attitude is one that says, I am responsible for, first of all, the level of my consciousness that I bring to my life and situations. I am responsible for my actions, and I am responsible for my happiness as an adult. An attitude of blaming others or blaming oneself is an unhelpful strategy to avoid responsibility, which lowers self-esteem. Taking responsibility paradoxically can sometimes involve asking for help, as long as I'm also making a genuine effort to help myself. Pillar and practice number 4, self-assertiveness. This refers to the practice of expressing my feelings and thoughts and wants and needs, both in words and in action. We pay a lot of attention to both in emotional sobriety and in self-esteem. It's not just about learning to express my needs and wants verbally, it's about taking action to meet my needs and wants. That's a central part of self-assertiveness. Expression of myself needs to be balanced with a willingness to consider context, the bigger picture. Am I at work or am I at home? Am I with somebody I love or someone I hardly know? And it comes with a sense of needing to consider the wants and needs of others, not just my own. Number 5, living purposefully. This involves asking ourselves questions like, what is the purpose of my life? Why am I here? What do I most deeply want to experience or to accomplish? What values or goals motivate me to keep learning and growing? And one that I know Alan pays a lot of attention to, what is most meaningful to me in my life? What has the most meaning? All of those involve the quest to live more purposefully and how motivating that can be when we're connected to a sense of purpose. And lastly, number 6, the practice of personal integrity. If my actions are consistent with my deepest values, I experience a sense of integrity, of wholeness, and integration. Personal authenticity, the experience that my actions and words are congruent with my internal experience, is also an expression of personal integrity. The more I practice personal integrity, especially when it's hard to do so, especially when I'm afraid to do so, the higher my level of self-esteem in that moment. To say a little bit more about the relationship between self-esteem theory and the practices of emotional sobriety, first of all, both of them are centered in our self-relationship. Both of them also involve a focus on our self-connection, the degree of our self-contact, but in a context of our connection and context with others. So they're self-focused, but it's always in a context of relationship to the world, relationship to other people. It makes a lot of sense that both of these ideas, self-esteem theory and emotional sobriety, have a lot in common because they're both centrally concerned with growing ourselves up, with achieving a higher level of psychological maturity and growth in our life. Both of them the idea of differentiation, as you've learned the last several weeks, if you've been with us, is central. Branden preferred to use the term individuation most of the time, but it's very similar in meaning. How do I become myself in my life? How do I learn self-support rather than relying so much on external support? How do I become more autonomous? All of those questions are very central to both emotional sobriety and to self-esteem theory. I'm aware of the time and I've gone over, so I'll just finish up by saying Three of Nathaniel Branden's books that I often recommend to clients and that I've mentioned all of here. One is Honoring the Self from the early 80s. The second is How to Raise Your Self-Esteem, again, a smaller paperback book that's very experientially oriented, but also describes the basics of the theory. And then the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. I'll leave you with one last quote from Branden about self-esteem to carry with you. Self-esteem is the reputation we acquire with ourselves. I like that one a lot. Self-esteem is the reputation we acquire with ourselves. And from a perspective of hopefully self-acceptance and self-encouragement, it's a valuable question for us to ask ourselves every day. How is my reputation with myself today? How am I doing with myself? How am I doing with my self-respect? With my self-confidence? So thank you all very much for your attention. And now I'll go to our panelists.
Wow. Thank you, Roger.
My pleasure, Thom.
That's beautiful. I took many notes, and I honestly, I would simply be doing it just because I'm just to do it, to add. I can't add anything to that. I'm really in a kind of a student mode as I'm listening to you talk. I'm taking lots of notes and thinking about some particular clients I'm beginning to work with that this stuff really applies to, and always feeling validated in stuff that I either am doing well or need to be reminded of doing along the way. So I have learned so much from you since I've known you, since we've been doing this, and I just appreciate you very much. So thank you.
I'm very touched, seriously, Thom. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah,
thanks
absolutely.
so much.
Absolutely.
And back at you as well. So
it's beautiful.
Thank you.
That covers the 2 guys with hair. What about the other guys?
Go ahead, Herb, and I'll
There we go. I forgot I was muted. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic, and I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much, Roger. What a great overview, and getting into the weeds also, and also the recommendations for some additional reading. I've heard about Nathaniel Branden from both of you guys for probably 30 years, and I acquired the books. But you don't get this stuff by osmosis. It was so resonant with my experience over these 30 years, despite the fact that I haven't read the books. In my step work in resentment inventory, there's the way I've been taught it and experienced it is there's 2 columns. That 3rd column is my belief about myself. And I was probably 7 or 8 years sober when that particular dynamic or dimension was revealed to me. I never had it, the awareness of looking at my beliefs. I could have talked about what I believe, but I didn't. I only saw the surface, and the framework that I use to attempt to explain it, my own understanding and experience of it, is what you talked about, the lens. My beliefs are the lenses through which I look.
Right.
I've created those lenses. I'm responsible for those lenses. The conundrum here is that I'm looking through the lens, so I'm not looking at the lens.
Yeah.
Until I'm asked some questions by some experienced people to look at the lens through which I'm looking.
Yeah.
And then I'm so embarrassed because I see the distortions and delusions that I absolutely believe to be true. And they were false. They were delusional.
Yeah.
I mean, I was literally turning red in my own room doing this analysis in my own presence. that the man that I am, with all the background and education that I have, and all the self-reflection and all the professionals and wonderful people I've been involved in, I have never seen under at the lenses. Now I could go on for a long time. I made, as Thom did, I made a couple pages of notes. And I'm particularly impressed, though, that it wasn't just me that created these lenses. They were formed by my genetics. They were formed in my family environment because of their belief system. They were formed by the culture that I live in. And I absorbed it, literally. And they were formative. But now, and the 6 pillars, number 1, I see. Number 2, I accept. Number 3, I am free. Number 4, I am agent. I have the agency. Alan brought that word within the last year. I have agency. I know the context now of my life. You talked about purpose. And the word that has come to me that has really helped me is that my response is in action, to be in alignment.
Mm-hmm.
To be in alignment. And I could go on, but it's a dynamic. Oh, what is it? The consciousness, I think, is the key. For me, the consciousness began to allow me to experience what I'm now talking about and to express it, to help other people to look at the lenses through which they're looking, so that they can begin to see the distortions and therefore unravel it to begin to see the truth. And the truth will set you free. At first, it will embarrass you. Thank you.
I love that. At first, it'll embarrass the crap out of you, but it will if you can get past that.
Because I have to then own it. I'm owned it.
Of course. Yeah. It's that way for me, Herb. It's totally that way for me. God, I loved how concisely you summarized several of those practices, Herb. That was great. Thank you so much for all that you shared there, man. Yeah, I mentioned under self-responsibility, the first thing I mentioned is I am responsible for the level of consciousness I bring to my life. Now, I often fall terribly short of the level that I would like to be able to bring or whatever, but that's been a very powerful idea for me. The level of focus, the level of attention, the level of kind of seriousness in a way, the level of consciousness I bring. I am responsible for that. That's a choice. That's a choice. And
that's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my prayer for anybody who comes in across my work in my workshops, is that they get that very thing. Everything will pop after that. Yeah.
No, I remember when I was confronted with that idea, what an aha moment that was.
Yeah.
I had treated my level of consciousness as a given.
Yeah.
I did not know that there was a possibility of changing it, of increasing it, of working with it in any kind of way. And when I heard that, it was like you said, Herb, just so many doors started opening up.
Right. Because
then I could start to look at the lens through which I was looking at my life through. And that part is so powerful. Raj, first of all, I love you so much. And I'm always so impressed with you. You've been an amazing friend and an amazing colleague to grow with through our lives, man. I mean, we've done countless number of workshops and intensives together and stuff like that before COVID and stuff. And we've done some amazing things with people and helping people discover new possibilities in their life. And, I think both of us use a lot of Branden's work as a pillar to our work with them in terms of how we do. And you did a remarkable job today. So I don't know if I ever shared this with you. So I was at a workshop. I was getting some of my continuing education units, and Nathaniel was there.
Yeah, you did. You mentioned that. Yeah.
We sat together, and it was a workshop on alcoholism. And the guy knew of me that was presenting, and he kept referring to me. And Nathaniel said, "Man, you really know a lot about this stuff." He says, we started chatting. He says, what do you think happens to self-esteem with this 12 steps? That was his question. He says, you know what? I would love for you to put together a book and write about how self-esteem changes as somebody works the steps. So I never did it. I mean, it's pursued some other things, but what I'm going to task us with is now for the next several weeks, let's go back through the steps. Let's take the steps one at a time. We'll look at Branden's writings and relate it to that step, as well as to take out what, the other stuff. And we will look at the same thing we did, and how do the steps increase your emotional sobriety? How do the steps impact your self-esteem?
100%.
So let's do it, guys. You guys all for it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Next time we'll start with step 1, and we'll use all these things that you brought in today and other stuff that we'll all do research on and bring in, and we'll start the meeting out by just talking about the step, and each one of us will start to discuss how we see some of the impact of that step on self-esteem.
Sounds good. Wow. Right away, because that would be very interesting to me, and hopefully very, very helpful for people who tune in, to this meeting or this workshop, as you say.
Well, we could also take notes as we go, and we can do what Dr. Branden wanted you to do, which is to put together a book on this.
That's it. There you go. Yes, it is.
It's probably, as you talked about it, Roger, in terms of the self-worth and the lack thereof.
Right.
Probably the worm in the wood that I see in my workshops. Yeah. It's the underlying problem in addiction. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a pretty astute observation. After all, no surprise, certainly coming from you, Herb, but because Branden called those things I was saying about arrogance and grandiosity and stuff, he called all of that pseudo self-esteem, right? I always like that.
Total overcompensation is all.
Yeah, total. And anyway, so great idea, Alan. Let's go with that.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. The first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. We're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.